Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer, and today we're speaking with Jessie Sutherland. Jessie is the director and founder of Intercultural Strategies. She's also a recipient of the 2023 BC Achievements Award. Jessie's the founder of Intercultural Strategies. She helps leaders and groups build cultures of belonging to create change in an inclusive and positive way. She works with organizations and communities to encourage diversity, build belonging, and ignite intercultural collaboration. It's so great to see you.
Hey.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks. Nice to see you. It's been a long time.
It has. And post-mortality wake-up call, hey?
That's such a great way to frame it. Yeah, it seems like it.
It's life-changing when it happens, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. So congratulations.
Thank you.
That is so cool. I was delighted to learn the news. And you're in great company for the BC Community Achievement Award. So what was that like for you?
The first thing I thought of was the time people put into writing letters of support and organizing the whole nomination. I didn't know that there was an application this year. So that was the first thought. And how can I pay that forward? Taking time and nominating somebody else, you know what I mean, in the future? And then the other piece was really grateful for all the incredible people that I've worked with over the years, because it's always been a collaborative process. And I've learned every time, done a project and integrated the learnings. And so that was it. And then the more I learned about the award and all that was going on, started getting quite excited.
So that's a lot of love.
Yeah, just really grateful. I just feel blessed because, you know, there's a lot of people doing amazing work that people just haven't taken the time to put a nomination in. And I think this kind of community work often goes undervalued. So I love that they have this award, and it makes me think about who, especially in younger generations, can we start supporting in this way so that they'll really see the value they have in the community.
I think it's great to see your hard work recognized. So congratulations. I guess it's been a couple of years since we last talked, and so much has happened, so many life-changing events, personally and in the world. So, where to start?
Where do you start with all of that? Yeah, I was, now that you bring it up, I think the last time we connected was just before COVID.
So we haven't talked since COVID, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. Reconciliation is ongoing, as is climate change. There's the war in Ukraine. All the crazy stuff in the U.S. politics, and some not so gentle reminders of our mortality. So, how are you?
In this moment, I'm really good. There were periods of time during the pandemic that it was personally very rough. And then also times where, a lot of grace happened and sort of serendipity and new opportunities. So in this moment, I actually feel fairly hopeful, even if the world is as it is. And I think that's because I have deepened my own conviction on what is the best way I can contribute. So I just focus on my sphere of influence.
Can you say more? Can you talk about hopefulness and hopelessness?
Well, actually, I usually don't like that word. So I'm sort of sitting here thinking, why did I use that word? I actually find the word hope is very fluffy and has little action attached to it. People are just hopeful and passive. So I usually don't use hope. So it's interesting that I use that. So hope, I guess, means that you see a potential pathway that could potentially be positive. And that's about it.
I have a couple of quotes that I lean on occasion. One is Rebecca Solnit, where she says, hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It's an axe that you break down doors with in an emergency. But there's also another one that I've kind of leaned on to and favor more lately by Seamus Heaney, who says, hope is not optimism, which expects things to turn out well, but something rooted in the conviction that there's good worth working for.
I love that one. And, more and more in my work, that's what I'm supporting different leaders and organizations to focus on, is where can you be that sort of demonstration project? So, for example, there's one community that's trying to address racism and hate in their entire city, and they're this small volunteer group. So what is the one pocket you can focus on that then you can amplify the successes around? So that is all we can do when it's that deep of a polarization, that deep of hate and racism, or whatever the ism is, or that whatever the situation is. So knowing where we can put our efforts and finding ways to amplify that, I think is really important. And also that was a big lesson of COVID. I mean, all of a sudden we are all homebound, and all the stuff flying through social media and people posting and all the dramas everywhere around the world and in our communities and the deepened polarization. If you did not learn how to shelter your mind during COVID, you did not do very well. At a certain point, it's not about sticking your head in the sand. It's deciding, where am I going to put my focus? So A, I am well, and B, I can support other people and the awesome things they're doing in the world. So that it is a little bit of choosing our focus.
And putting your effort into those things that are worth working for.
And also being aware of what's going on. I would never say, don't look at the news, or don't, it's really important to know what's happening globally and in our communities and in our life. But if it's impacting us to the point that we're in paralysis, or we don't know where to put our efforts, then choose a focus. Keep connected and aware, but don't let it be what drowns you. The great thing about the last 3 years is it's broken through a lot of denial. People that have been working on residential schools or issues around Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, anyone that's worked in different communities knows about the racism that people experience at the hand of police. So these things are not disputable anymore. So we can actually just focus on what we can do to move forward. So I like to think about it as we were all born into our current systems and ways of being. And that was, depending on your spiritual outlook, by chance. But we all have a responsibility to make that choice. Are we going to replicate what we've been born into, or innovate a new pathway forward? And that pathway doesn't mean necessarily taking on the whole world, because these habits of interaction are in our moment by moment choices. So we have a choice of replicating these ways of being, these systems within our own families, our neighborhoods, our school community, whatever it is that we have influence, or if we're working on social change or environmental change in those realms as well.
How do you get through the clutter? How do you get through the genetic, the cultural influences that we all carry with us? But what you just said sounds so easy, but it's not.
It's not. I would say the fastest way to personal growth, emotional intelligence, is try this. What we're talking about. I did a month-long meditation retreat years ago with Thich Nhat Hanh in Plum Village. And he talked about get humans together as like a sack of potatoes. You only get your dirt off when you bump up against each other. So that when you can learn the tools like you're talking about of getting rid of the clutter is key to be able to do that. And for me, what's helped is I'm someone that needs to go broad in my mind first and then go specific. Other people need to just stay specific or go specific and then global. But my mind, I have to find meaning in what I do in the specific. So for me, it was really helpful to spend a few years researching about the world and then me figuring out how I wanted to contribute. And the pieces that really impacted me and are foundation to all my work is the research that has been done around the world about the rise and fall of civilizations and cultures, and that at the disintegration phase, it's all cyclical everywhere. There's more polarization, more stress, less creativity to solve problems. People are more disconnected to nature, all of those things. And the cultures that die off versus the ones that go on to thrive and go through the whole cycle and start to regenerate and all that are the ones where individuals, not in mass organized ways, but serendipity, reconnect to their own core values and start living them out in new ways. And they become sort of the yeast, so to speak, of the thriving. And so when we see that, then we're like, look what's happening around me. I wonder where we are in the cyclical nature of things. And what is the most important thing I can do is A, connect to my own values, and B, help other people connect to their values. And why I see this as so important, not only for the decluttering that you're talking about, but also we live in such rapidly changing times, uncertain times, turbulent times, whatever you want to call it, opportunity times. Everyone has their own flavor word. And really, there is no cookie cutter approach. There can be frameworks and guiding principles. Whoever is working on change can come to an agreement around guiding principles. Then we know we're going to navigate whatever changes or whatever uncertainty gets thrown our way in our change processes. And the other thing about values that I've found over time is that, you mentioned polarization. Often polarization ignites our deepest sense of injustice or offense when we meet the other who's in a polarized position. Yeah. And the best way to bypass that, in my experience, because what it does when we get triggered like that is ignite sort of a biochemical reaction in our brain. So we will either fight, freeze, and a bunch of other Fs. And so there's one methodology, which is you soothe your triggers, you get curious, all those things. And that's so important, especially if it's ignited trauma within yourself. So therefore, you need to take care of that so you know how you can respond in a more powerful way. But the way I like to see it when I'm bumped up against polarization is this is an opportunity to strengthen the values between us, because we really only live out our values in relationship with others. So we can say we believe in honesty or whatever it is, but really it's in our moment-to-moment choices. So then it becomes a focus on what we're growing together rather than what we're fighting about.
So I think the question I want to ask is, how do we build bridges? I was reading The Persuaders by Anand Giradharas. Alicia Garza, who is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matters, talks about one of the issues with social movements is that they are too restrictive in terms of who they let in to help with a particular movement. In other words, you either agree with us 100% in what we're doing or you can't join. So rather than shutting down a conversation, how do we open them up?
That's why I find a few things really critical when working on change or when doing anything with other humans, really. The first piece is agreeing on the guiding principles. I often introduce the idea of giving each other a soft landing, which means as human beings, I have an inner universe, you have an inner universe, each individual has an inner universe. At some point, we're going to trample on something that the other person cherishes. That's a given. There's no way to have regular connection and spontaneity without accidentally saying or doing something. We were born into these systems, so we're going to make mistakes. So the soft landing means if I offend you, Dawn, you will assume I just need more information first, and then we'll problem solve. That will be our first approach, and I'll do the same. So that if we can come to that agreement, then we're assuming the person is well-intentioned and just needs more information. If you exhaust that, then we can look at other ways of resolving the problem or collaborating or whatever. And sometimes it doesn't mean we ever come to an agreement on something, but we might have more empathy and compassion and understanding of where the other person is going from. So for example, in the US, right after, I always use this example for some reason, right after, I guess it was the 2016, was it, or election, very deeply polarized. And there was a group that had half Democrats, half Republican. And when we did this work around teasing out on a values-based way, this one woman who was very pro-gun basically ended up sharing a story about her experience in service in the Middle East and how that taught her that the value of self-reliance, and she was not going to ever rely on anyone else. So when the rest of the group got that, she explored how she could live out that value more. And she came up with all these other things, nothing to do with guns, that she was going to move forward through in her volunteer work in her community. So even though everyone else was more focused on collective stuff, there was deepened compassion or understanding with how her experiences led her to certain places and acceptance of how she was living them out, these values, and also broadened her idea of different ways you can live out those values. So I think, getting back to your social movement and the call in and call out culture, starting from the premise that we are all ever growing and ever learning. And in fact, the social change that has to happen in social environmental movements is huge. And one of the pieces is this hierarchy or call in, call out culture, or one of the most recent things I've been working on is the covert sabotage that can happen just because of territoriality and jealousy and nothing else.
Can you say more? Maybe unpack that?
So I think most people working in social change have had experiences of where they're just picking up momentum in their change efforts, and then someone from the inside starts withholding information, excluding you from meetings, creating a distorted narrative about you, to the point where it becomes a toxic environment. And either you leave or you somehow get shuffled out or into a insignificant position. I first learned about this when I was studying with researchers and activists and practitioners from around the world. And each scholar and practitioner told me this was a big issue in peace building, deep-rooted conflict, social environmental change. And at the time, this was back in year 2000, I didn't really pay attention. And now, 23 years later, I actually launched a program to address it because I see that as a big piece to shift in the work that folks working on change are doing.
So you talked about what you were working on 23 years ago. It's been a few years since we've talked. What's changed for you at Intercultural Strategies? Where are you today versus where you were 3 years ago?
Let me see. Oh, well, definitely a deepening of everything. With the pandemic, it fostered a lot of collaboration and also figuring out what people needed and how to deliver it in a way that supported them the most. So some of the things that happened over the pandemic was delivering virtually, first of all, and then delivering it in bite-sized pieces that are relevant to what people are going through. So one of the, as the guiding principle in my work is that people with lived experience are the experts because they know how they were pushed out and what values and relationships and systems were used to push them out. And so my work is always around supporting their voice, dignity, and leadership, and supporting, them as leaders in the change. And so what I noticed in the pandemic was so the Belonging Matters conversation series does that, work with folks with lived experience who have similar lived experience, and through that develop the leadership for leading the change in collaboration with system influencers and the rest of the community. But first, there's always the Belonging Matters conversations. And during the pandemic, with all the leaders I usually work with being exhausted and overwhelmed, I thought, why not try it with them and see if it can be helpful for them? So that's been wonderful. And that led to the workplace sabotage. One of the people in the program asked for one that was customized just around that. So I'm just in the middle of delivering that program right now with people from all sorts of different places working on different issues. And so that's kind of exciting to be able to accompany leaders in a process around building belonging from the inside out. And really now they're my ideal folks to collaborate with, because I truly believe that to really be effective in our work, we need to have built belonging from the inside out. And any change effort only goes as deep as the people that are in leadership positions. If they have not done their inner and outer skill work, we'll only get so far. So that's pretty exciting. And then I collaborated with lots of colleagues. So, I've been working on Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationship building since 1990 and launched different national public conversations back in the year 2000. And so when we collaborated on, I think it's called Essential Worldview Skills in a Rapidly Changing World. It was a 3-week program that's now a self-study program with Indigenous and non-Indigenous speakers on how to engage worldviews, how to build unity across differences, polarized differences, and how to regenerate worldviews. And the other one that happened was collaborating with lots of diverse folks I've worked with over the year on addressing racism from the inside out, how to address our own bias and racism within ourselves, how to address it as a bystander, and how to address it as a target or somebody in a leadership position supporting a target. So those were some things that we did over the pandemic, and also worked in the disability sector for a couple of years, supporting some awesome emerging leaders. And now really through the process, I was also working with Michael Quinn Patton, who's the founder of Principles Focused Evaluation. And we collaborated on some international projects during the pandemic to teach out the principles-focused evaluation, because he coached me quite a few years ago how to embed principles-focused evaluation into the Belonging Matters framework. And so we were teaching it out to teams. Like right now, I'm training a team in Ukraine Ukraine and Cameroon, but I think there's been 12 teams over the pandemic. So in India, Nepal, Australia, South Africa, Burundi, Nigeria, France, Quebec. I'd have to look through the list, but we did 12 teams so far. So that's been really exciting work, and it's deepened the work. So now the big thing now, when you're saying what's new with intercultural strategies, it's ready to be fully trained out from how to create your social change strategy using a framework that engages people with lived experience and the diversity, as well as system influencers, so you can bridge that gap and increase your impact in whatever you're doing. And then there's the how to measure the Belonging Matters conversations. So that's being trained out so people can facilitate that themselves in the work that they're doing, which is engaging diverse folks with lived experience on whatever their focus is. And then how to measure the impact and integrate reflective learning practices so that you create an organizational and movement culture that is based on learning and growing. So that kind of goes back to your original thing with this person talking about the calling in, calling out. And I think the only way to do it is to establish from the beginning that we are a learning and growing organization. And this is how we handle things when they emerge so that we all learn and grow.
I was at the Rural Island Economic Forum in April on Gabriel Island, and one of the speakers, an Indigenous woman from Alert Bay, said, if you're going to come and visit us and check out our community, our museums, and our people, do the work. And I was struck by that. That was an invitation to learn more about Alert Bay, its history, to learn more about reconciliation. And I think she's asking us to make sure that we ask the right questions. It doesn't mean that we're going to get it wrong sometimes, but at least we're going to come into a new community with thoughtful or maybe heartfelt questions. What strikes me about that, with our discussion about polarization, is that it seems that many humans don't want to do that kind of work. So what has to change?
I wonder if it's having a different mindset to start with. So when I think I've mentioned this to you before, when I think about culture, our personal culture, our collective culture, cultures in general, I love the metaphor of a tree. And this is Kalpana Das that came up with this, where what she talks about is the foliage is like the things we see, language, dress, governance, things that we see that are obvious. The trunk are our institutions. So education, health, government, that kind of thing. And the roots are our values. And what I've done is I've added another layer below the roots, which is water. And that's our worldviews. And basically the worldviews feed our roots and feed the trunk and feed the foliage. So whatever human problem is, bad fruit, if we can go straight down to the roots and take care of that, then the tree, it's about changing the ecosystem more than the putting the pesticide on the fruit, so to speak, as a metaphor. So what I'm trying to say is that if we see ourselves in a tree metaphor, I'm just going to use that. I'm going with it right now. I love the bamboo tree because it has the longest roots in my understanding, and they can survive any storm because they're very flexible and they bend with the wind. So a tree will not survive long in a storm if there's very short roots and are not protected by other trees. So when we understand that what's happening in polarization is we're in a little bit of a storm and our roots are being shooken, we have an opportunity to explore our roots. So in some situations, there's a polarization that I'm never going to agree with that person, but I now have an opportunity to understand my roots and deepen my values more. In fact, if that worldview is deeply concerning to me, I will reinvigorate and I'll have more conviction to grow out those values wherever I can. So when we see polarization as an opportunity to deepen our roots and also increase our emotional and intercultural intelligence, then it becomes a human experience. And when we're able to do that, the inner freedom that arises, and also the opportunity to see the world through multiple windows, that you then, there are some windows that you'll be exposed to that you will learn about that will change your roots and worldview, that will be for the best. So I wonder if it's partially a mindset thing, when an us versus them perspective really means there is an extremely fragile sense of belonging going on. So if we can deepen our own sense of belonging and our own roots and our own ecosystem, we know we need a good ecosystem needs diverse perspectives to thrive, or diverse plants, or whatever you want to call it, nutrients. I'm probably not the best person to do a metaphor like that because I know nothing about gardening.
I like the tree analogy. I think it works well. I was thinking the late composer Stephen Sondheim may have offered a unique way as well to view these conversational ecosystems during his interview with, I think it was D.T. Max, where he said, "My idea is that every moment of human intercourse, like right now between you and me, there are 64 of you in this room and 64 of me in this room that we bring into a conversation. So every sentence we say, any intercourse we have is filled with layers." You've already talked about how they include examining one's beliefs, values, judgments, emotions, practices, politics, and positionality. I guess where I'm struck is when the conversations go sideways, when our body chemistry changes against a particular point of view and we shut down. How do we deal with that?
Thank you for saying that, because I think people miss that in the polarization that's happening. One of the first things to develop our skills for navigating polarization, or engaging, I should say, with polarization, is figuring out how to create your own inner safety, because polarization will shake us on that root level. And if we don't know our own inner terrain and how to create that safety, it's really hard to be curious about the other. So for myself, I just notice in myself, looks like we're going to the roots. And if it's something that brings up maybe something unresolved in me, or some kind of previous trauma or whatever, just being aware of that and knowing I need to take care of that. So when you talk about 64 layers or 64 people in the room, or however you framed it, sometimes those parts of us are like a baby or a toddler, or so being aware of what's being activated in us so that we can choose which part of us we respond from. Taking care of all parts of us, and it can be done very quickly. Like sometimes when I know it's activating something very young, I swaddle myself and then I carry on the conversation. It doesn't have to take long. So there's different ways, but if I can soothe my own trigger and my own values, then I can be curious about the other person, and it just ask questions. And who is in charge of the story? Is the other person in charge of the story? Are you in charge of the story? Or are you making meaning together? And being aware that regardless of what happens, I am in charge of my own story. I can engage with someone else's story. I can ask questions and be curious, but I am still, just because somebody else believes that doesn't mean I have to. And also there might be a way to make some kind of meaning. So I really differentiate polarization versus disinformation. So polarization, or worldview difference is another way you can put it, is based on actual things that are true. And I know truth is a very perspective-taking way, but it's not fiction created by people that are trying to manipulate us intentionally. And again, that's up for debate, right? So polarization or worldview difference might be diverse cultures, anything that's diverse, that has different beliefs about what our role as human beings are on the planet and how we organize accordingly. But disinformation, I don't see as polarization. I see as root rot. I mean, it's hard to notice your own root rot because you'd probably change it if you knew you had root rot. But is this root rot I'm encountering, or is this really different worldview that I have an opportunity to look through a new window? And guess what? My window might expand, or I might just fall more deeply in love with the window that I already have.
I liked your term, "are we making meaning together?" Suggests that there's a collaboration occurring in a conversation. But I'm struck by my reaction to my sister saying to me one day that she thought Donald Trump was a patriot. And we were not making meaning together because I reacted badly. And it really caused a rift in our relationship. And I don't know that it will ever be quite the same. I can't change her mind or persuade her that Donald Trump is not a patriot. When you're in a conversation and you have different points of view, I'm not likely going to change your mind, but there may be something I can say that you might think about and at some point in the future may reconsider. One of the things that I'm noticing, especially with the conversations I have, is when I get me out of the way, the conversation always goes much more smoothly, and there is more of an opportunity to make meaning together. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well,
or is that too much of a...
No, not at all. That's one of the beauties of the last 3 years, is that I would say what's common when I work with in our Belonging Matters conversations for leaders is the polarization within our own families. Before, it was change makers trying to change this in the world and that in the world. Now it's like, oh my God, whether your in-laws were anti-vaxxers and telling your own kids that you were giving them poison by getting vaccine, or whether tons of division around Trump supporters or not supporters, within families, even in frigging Canada.
Yeah, there's no shortage of issues,
And
whatever it is.
Issues. So being able to navigate this is great training ground, because this is exactly the skills we need to be able to bring out and integrate marginalized voices. And I'm not talking about the root rot, but people that like worldviews and perspective that are on the margins, I believe are exactly what the world needs for moving forward. So mastering these skills within our families is the hardest work. It's way easier to do it with strangers. Everyone finds their own path. I really don't believe there's a cookie cutter way. For myself, because I get so indignant, I have had to come up with some one-liners for myself so that I have an immediate response that will lead in the direction I want. So, for example, I see things quite differently. I'm curious about how you've come to that conclusion. Would you be willing to listen to me afterwards about how it lands for me and my perspective, so that I'm not just giving airtime to a perspective that might be deeply offensive to me? I'm establishing from the beginning and asking permission if at some point I can also share, so that there isn't just being a receptacle to something, that doesn't agree with me on a fundamental level. But that's my human nature.
Does anyone ever say no?
When I ask the question, it has happened once, actually. But no, when I always ask permission. And would you be willing? Questions like that. That's interesting. And they might even say a story that led them to that. I might say, oh, that's interesting because I have a similar experience, but I came to a different conclusion. Isn't that interesting? But getting to the story, getting to the values, and then making meaning together.
In many ways, that's a form of deep canvassing. And they did that in Los Angeles, where I think it was an LGBTQ issue that was on the voting platform, and it didn't go the way that everybody thought it would go. And so many of the LGBTQ organizations did some deep canvassing to try and learn how people thought. And they would frame their questions much like you've suggested, where I want to learn from you why, but would you mind if I told you what I thought at the end of the conversation? And again, that may not persuade somebody to change their mind, but it would give them pause. It would give them something to think about.
And more importantly, it enables you to deepen your own roots. The more you're able to do that, it's like the roots shoot down in the earth. And the more you're able to hold steady in the midst of polarized conversations, the more it really amplifies your own values. You're able to weather bigger storms as you navigate them. I do believe we're at an amazing crossroads at the moment. And any change effort that doesn't have in its strategy how to unearth worldviews and values are not going to be effective.
That's a lot to consider. Do you want to go deeper on that? Maybe unpack it a bit?
Yeah, and I guess that's where the whole Belonging Matters framework came from, through trial and error over 30 years, that the belonging lens of looking at anything gets straight to the values and worldviews involved. So just asking, what does home mean to you, is like, those water witches looking for water with those sticks, those triangular sticks.
Yeah.
If I ask that question and find backdoor ways and, in different ways, I might find the water source in a second. Might take 3 weeks, but eventually I'll find the worldview through questions around belonging and home. And they'll take us straight to our values, and they'll take us straight to where the knife went in, where people felt pushed out. And it'll go straight to where people have agency, how they can build belonging for themselves. So it's really a way that any given social or environmental problem, if the first question is, who are the people most impacted? You're going to get to the people that know the worldview and values that have been eroded. And therefore, what the rest of us need to grow within ourselves, our systems, our attitudes and behaviors, policies and practices. So it's the fastest way in my experience of getting to values and worldviews that are conversational, that aren't just intellectual, that people can hide behind some fancy academic research and connect with to be able to make meaning together. So when somebody hears how something has eroded their sense of home or belonging, they're going to be connected from a heart place, which will then activate the action that we need. So any methodology that doesn't unearth values and worldviews or activate the heart in some kind of way will likely replicate the past, because we are all conditioned by the frames that we've been born into. And we need new ways of going through that open up to different frames. And then that is just the vulnerability of practicing new skills, making mistakes, reflecting and learning.
So let me try a question there. We have millions of people who have been displaced by war, famine, politics, and climate change. We have this disconnectedness politically for multiple reasons in societies. How do you find a sense of place? How do you find a sense of place and belonging in that chaos?
Well, that's the thing. It's that everyone has an experience of belonging or not belonging. No matter where we are, no matter what horrific situation we or somebody else finds themselves in, when we ask, how can I create more of a sense of home or belonging for myself? There might be one iota of a thing. When people can start feeling a sense of agency and then a collective sense of agency, I see big things happening. And it's what I guess, what I'm really working on in the Belonging Matters framework is providing some tools and frameworks for people to build that sense of inner belonging and resiliency, outer skills belonging. But then on the other hand, the people that are system influencers or the rest of the community, they have huge amount of work because they are not only born into these frames and systems, but they're replicating them without realizing. So offering opportunities to support how to listen and act on what you hear in an effective way and collaborate with people with lived experience. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but really, no matter where you are, you can create a sense of place and connectedness, even if it's a pit stop. So somebody might be in a refugee camp or placed in an institution for some reason or another. But if that person and people around them are thinking about how can we create a sense of home here, then there is, even when it's a temporary connection to a place, a sort of a different pathway forward comes.
How do I sign up?
Well, I'm going to be doing a facilitator training soon. But yeah, there's lots of ways to tap into the different programs that we're running right now. But and always excited to collaborate with people that are interested in this kind of work.
I feel like I've asked too many questions and not enough about your work and not enough about intercultural strategies. So
I like talking about what you want to talk about.
Well, thank you. But well, I'm just curious, but what keeps you up at night? What lights you up?
Oh, where I feel the most excitement is when I work with people, they are building that sense of belonging within themselves. And what I mean by that is that going to that place where we've personally felt pushed out and then going through a process to build that sense of inner belonging, inner home, and bringing that out into the world, and then seeing the major impact increase. So for me, that's very fulfilling. I mean, I love working on these big projects as well that works with lots of people. But when I see the personal change in people. And then when they run off, they run with it and I just get to cheer them on in their awesomeness. That really excites me. And it's sort of my long-term, I think this comes back to a mindset. And the mindset is that there's some things in my lifetime I will not see the fruits of. And I've come to terms with that, but I'm still going to till the soil and I'm still going to plant the seeds. Some are going to take root in my lifetime and I'll get to see it all bloom and everything. And other things will never take seed, probably never bloom or whatever. And others, it might be a few generations away, or it might be a year after I die. I don't know, but just a long-term vision of it. So I am very, very, very interested in collaborating with people that are interested in doing the inner and outer work at the same time, because I have found time and time again, when we skip the inner work part, we only go so far. The inner landscape of people in leadership positions will eventually be a stumbling block for a whole change process if they're not engaged with their values and worldviews and sense of belonging. We tend to each other's sense of belonging. It's like it becomes circular, because I've also discovered sometimes why there's a roadblock is that it's the place within people they haven't tended to that needs tending to, and they can learn. So if they can engage on that level, it's good for everybody.
Yeah, it's hard. It's easy to ignore the shadow or those dark spots. I'm reminded of them every day.
None of us are perfect. Recently, I was facilitating an Indigenous, non-Indigenous community dialogue. And I started it off by naming the systems we've been born into and the habits I notice in Indigenous and non-Indigenous dialogues, and therefore an invitation to change those habits. And I was quite specific about it. What is that habit, that colonial habit in essence, and what is the opportunity to change in this dialogue, just those habits. And so when we can engage, start naming what is common in our ways of interacting and invite people into a new space, but also how we'll deal with it when it comes up, so that it's not about bad Jessie, she just said something ableist or this or that. It's like, wow, thanks for telling me. And then I actually expand my worldview. The more I learn about my ableist frame, I expand and I change. I am more aware that I live in a performative culture that values a certain kind of production, and how freeing it is to start to expand that worldview to beyond that. And that can be any worldview. So I don't know if that made sense.
No, it does. Absolutely. I was just thinking my supervisor occasionally says, to change things, we need to find new questions. We need to ask the questions differently. David White says, don't ask the first question that comes to mind. Ask the second or the third. Go below the surface to find the real question that you want the answers to. No, I think it's well said and beautiful. So what haven't we talked about that we should?
What's coming up for me is like our worldviews, scientific and otherwise, are sort of converging right now. I think most people agree we are an interconnected world. We're not separate and distinct. And so all of these things are such that you're mentioning are such opportunities to stand up for connection. So how can we stay connected when it's uncomfortable? How can we engage across differences so that we can address things more effectively? So that was what I just all of a sudden I don't know what spurred me to think about connectedness, but I feel like sometimes the way I like to see our transition, if you want to call it transition right now, threshold, opportunity, challenge, I don't know, whatever word works for people. Sometimes I see it like we're all interconnected. So I have a visual of a spider's web, and we're in the process of moving from what I like to call systems of exclusion into cultures of belonging. That's the opportunity. So what is our personal system of exclusion? What are the systems on the bigger level, like governance, education, health? And how can we transform that into a culture of belonging? So each act of exclusion is like cutting a piece of the web. And all we're doing is going back to the web and putting it back together. And sometimes it's kind of like knitting. I can't remember what you call it, drop stitch. you might be knitting a scarf and you've missed a spot. You have to unravel the whole thing and pick up the stitch and then continue knitting on. So it's each experience of exclusion is actually hurting us all in its web. And together we're weaving it back. And everyone's contributing their strength and their expertise. So people with lived experience are like, hello, here's the hole.
I love it. It's a great analogy.
This is how the hole happened. I was there. I'm impacted. And then other people in the web are like, no way. Hey, I can bring my this, or I can help with that. And let's learn from you and let's do it better next time. So it's not about just changing a policy. It's everything. It's our attitudes, our behaviors, our policies, our practices, our systems. But what's exciting about this, and that's what I hope people really get from this, it's exciting because we know what we're leaving behind. We know the system exclusion we are leaving behind. We're not exactly sure what it's going to be like when we get to this new culture of belonging, or whatever you want to say, and how it'll be manifested in different ways. But what we can agree to is the guiding principles and how we're going to address our moment by moment choices and decisions and problems. So that I kind of see it like if we take a boat analogy, the rudder is our values. And we've all agreed on these principles. If we haven't, then everyone's paddling there's a storm and everyone's paddling in a different direction. So we're headed to some horizon. We don't know where exactly, but we've decided how we're going to navigate these storms, and we will get there. We don't know when, and we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But so it's when you can get into that mode, it's a pretty exciting process. So when I work with groups, I'm always excited because I am nervous because I don't know where we're going to end up, but I do know we are going to unlock so many hidden talents, and we are going to engage incredible diversity, and we're going to work really well together, and something amazing is going to come out of it. We just don't know what yet.
That's exciting. I was just making notes. I was thinking about our conversation, and a couple of things have stuck with me. One is, of course, that there are a lot of good things worth working for. The influence that you have, I've always thought of as a ripple on a lake, and they may impact us immediately, or a month from now, or centuries from now. But the things that we say and do have an impact on the people that we touch, which is why I think that if we want to change the world, we have to do it one conversation at a time. That's why I like so much and respect the work you're doing. And it would be a joy to be in one of those sessions with you, to watch this group start off on their journey, not knowing where it's going to go, but yet when you get to the end of it, see the change that occurred.
And I do find the worse, the more, I hate using the word marginalized because it's like, but yeah, the more pushed out a group is, the more marginalized, that's when the most incredible work happens. I do believe the people that have been pushed out the furthest have the sensitivity, the insight, and the talent that the world needs.
That's exciting. So how do we find you?
Go to my website,
interculturalstrategies.ca.
You got it.
It's a bookmark on my computer.
You can email me, jessie@interculturalstrategies.ca. And for people interested, we have a new Culture of Belonging temperature check, and that's www.cultureofbelonging.ca. And it's a free tool to kind of get a sense of your leadership style and competencies around this, your team, and then your change strategy. So there's 3 aspects to the temperature check: yourself, your team, and your change strategy.
Listen, it's great to see you. I really appreciate you hanging out with us.
I love chatting with you. So anytime.
No, it's been a real joy. So let's do it sooner, okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
We've been speaking with Jessie Sutherland, who's the director and founder of Intercultural Strategies. You can find out more about Jessie and her work at interculturalstrategies.ca. That's another episode of the Conversation Lab. This radio program and podcast is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver's downtown east side on the territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our gratitude and thanks to them, as well as the many nonprofit organizations, community groups, and changemakers around the world that support this program. If you enjoyed the Conversation Lab, please consider becoming a member of Co-op Radio to support this program and the many others produced by hundreds of volunteers. And if you have a story to share or know someone who does, please have them contact us at co-opradio.org, theconversationlab.ca, and on many social media and podcasting platforms. This is a DYI passion project, and the music is by Jason Shaw. Thanks, Jason, and thank you for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.